Good morning, everyone. We're just waiting for our Facebook Live to start and we'll get going here. We want to make sure that our Facebook folks are able to watch this. There we go. So good morning. I'm Paul Markle, Executive Director of the Barrie Chamber of Commerce, and I'd like to thank you for joining us today for our session on embracing diversity. I'd like to begin today's session with a land acknowledgement. This is something that we have committed to doing this on a regular basis. So I'm still struggling with some of the wording, but in keeping with Indigenous protocol and building respectful relationships between Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples of Canada, it's customary to acknowledge the traditional territories and ancestral lands of the Indigenous peoples. So we'd like to acknowledge the sacred land on which we operate has been the site of human activity for 15,000 years. This land is the ancestral land of the Huron-Wendat and the Anishinaabe. The treaty was signed for this particular parcel of land, collectively referred to as the Williams Treaty. We're dedicated to honoring Indigenous history and culture. We also recognize the enduring presence of Indigenous peoples on this land, and we're committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect. Miigwech. So diversity in the workplace is much more at the forefront of discussion than ever before. And the benefits of embracing it are clear. Increased creativity and innovation, better local market knowledge, and improved employee engagement are just the tip of the iceberg. If you haven't taken steps towards embracing diversity, however, it can feel overwhelming. Fear of doing it wrong can stop us from doing it at all. And then we can miss out on incredible opportunities for ourselves, our teams, our customers, and our community. So we're glad that you joined us today to learn more about how you can take those first steps into embracing diversity and why you should really want to. This 2-hour session, our experts are going to cover understanding immigration and diversity in Simcoe County, what the benefits are of diversity, understanding implicit bias, cultural safety and humility, and how do I get involved? So joining us today are Rudy Gruwell and Sandra Lee. Rudy has earned his Honors Bachelor of Science in Interdisciplinary Study of Human Nature from Lakehead University, specializing in psychology and sociology. Currently, Rudy is about to complete his Honors Bachelor for Social Work from Lakehead University and is doing his practicum at the Simcoe County Local Immigration Partnership. In both school and out, Rudy is actively involved in human rights, equity, diversity, and inclusion research, initiatives, and training. And Rudy has been with us before, so welcome back, Rudy. Nice to see you again. Joining us as well is Sandra Lee, Simcoe County Local Immigration Partnership. She is the manager of Local Immigration Partnership for Simcoe County. And in this role, Sandra has been working with a broad spectrum of community stakeholders to improve economic, social, and political outcomes for newcomers living in Simcoe County. The Simcoe County Local Immigration Partnership was established in 2011 and followed a period of research and community consultations. The County of Simcoe launched a community settlement strategy in October of 2012, and this work is funded by Immigration, Refugees, and Citizenship Canada and the County of Simcoe. And I'm proud to say that the Barrie Chamber of Commerce is now has a seat on the Local Immigration Partnership, and that's why we're having these fantastic discussions and webinars, so that we can bring this great information to our businesses and get more involved. As I said in the opening, sometimes you just got to get the lid off the can, right? And that's exactly what we're working on. So today we're going to have about an hour and a half presentation from our two presenters, and then we're going to go directly into a Q&A. So if you have questions, please put them into the Q&A rather than the chat. They're just easier for us to moderate with afterwards. And you can do that throughout. You're not going to interrupt anybody. Those questions are going to be important. And again, in an hour and a half, you may have questions at the beginning that you forget by the end. So if you have one, pop it in. There's no bad questions whatsoever. So with that, I believe, I'm not sure who's starting. Is it Sandra? It is. Okay. And I'm going to step into the background and pay attention, and I'll be back when we get to the Q&A portion. Thanks. And go ahead.
Thank you. Can you see the screen now?
Yeah, you just have to put it into presentation mode.
Yep.
There we go.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We're very happy to be joining the Barrie Chamber of Commerce this morning to share information about embracing diversity. And Rudy and I are going to share different information based on our areas of expertise. And I'm going to speak a little bit about just the nuts and bolts of immigration in Simcoe County and better understanding who is in it here in our communities. And then I'm going to turn it over to Rudy, who is going to talk about embracing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And then towards the end of the conversation, it's going to come back to me, and I'm just going to talk about some of the ways you may be able to get involved in our community. And I'm very pleased to be joined today with Rudy Graywall from Building Bridges Towards Mutual Understanding. Rudy did have his practicum with us. He's finished now, and I'm pretty sure that I watched his graduation ceremony online yesterday. So congratulations, Rudy. I think you formally have your degree.
Thank you.
So I'm just going to give you a bit of background about the Simcoe County Local Immigration Partnership in case you haven't heard about the LIP, and that's often how people refer to us in the community. It's the acronym. And we're established in 2011, so we're actually celebrating our 10th year this year. And our work is guided by the Community Settlement Strategy, which was published in 2012. The Community Settlement Strategy was a result of community consultations, some very formal research, literature reviews from other communities, and it contains a set of recommendations for our community on how to develop welcoming communities. Community settlement strategies are really designed around the attraction, retention, and integration of newcomers in our communities. And so our community settlement strategy is based on 4 themes of recommendations: the theme of readiness, and really this kind of training fits in there, which was really to prepare our communities for the fact that we have a growing immigrant demography in Simcoe County. But also tied in with that is the second theme of opportunity, which is really making sure that we're maximizing that new talent in our communities and supporting their integration economically. And then Celebrate looks at how we can make our communities more multicultural. And then lastly, under the theme of Inspire, is supporting immigrants into positions of leadership in our communities. So that strategy was published in 2012. We've subsequently published 2 progress reports, one in 2016 and one in 2020, that sort of outline the progress that's been made in our community around the recommendations. We will publish a new community settlement strategy in 2023. We are waiting for the 2021 census data to help inform the actual immigration status in our communities. And then as we look at the immigration data later in this presentation, we always have to do that with a lens that this was what the community looked like, a snapshot in May of 2016, and it's now 5 years later. And on top of that, 5 years later, we've had a pandemic. And it's been our observation, so not statistical data, but anecdotal data, that the pandemic has accelerated outward migration from the GTA, and that has resulted in increased immigration in Simcoe County in the last year. So basically, my presentation today is going to focus on, where people are coming from, why they're coming here, how they're coming here, and who is living in our communities. I'm going to take you through a lot of Simcoe County data, but then I'm going to drill down to the city of Barrie. I think when we, our borders are fluid. And so individuals may live in our community, but work in another community, or they may work in our community and live in another community. So it's really helpful to look at the snapshot of Simcoe County as a whole, but also from welcoming individuals in our community, we also need to look at who's specifically in Barrie. So in 2016, there were 61,605 immigrants living in our communities, and that had been a 20% increase in the previous 10 years. When we're looking at comparison data we always look at 2006 and 2016 because they're comparable data. In 2011, the federal government moved to the National Household Survey and away from the long form census where we get immigration data. And so that data was skewed because it wasn't mandatory responding to it. And so that is why we look at the 10-year period right now. So we also look at recent immigrants in our communities. And so today, when we're talking about recent immigrants, we're talking about people who have been in the country for 5 years or less, and therefore need more support in integrating into our communities, whether that's on a relational, social level, or whether it's at an economic level. And then we also have people in our communities who are not here permanently. Those individuals, particularly in the city of Barrie, our international student population, are really important to think about as far as welcoming them into our communities and potentially converting them to immigrants when they graduate. So this particular map looks at the intensity of immigrant population change in Simcoe County between 2006 and 2016. And when you look at this map, it's really interesting to note that the Highway 400 runs up pretty much the middle of where you see the differences in the color. And so we have more significant intensification in Bradford, West Gwillimbury and Innisfil, but also similarly in New Tecumseh and Essa, so those communities that border York Region and Peel Region, and then up into Barrie. And then we also have a small increase in the southwest part of the community over in Collingwood and Wasaga Beach. So those are the actual numbers, which is probably a little bit hard to see in the presentation, but which we can send. Usually when we're doing this in person, we print this off as a handout and give this as an extra so that people can see it better. But oftentimes when you look at increases and it's expressed as a percentage, you think, well, it's because the number was low to begin with when it's a high percentage. But for example, when you look at Bradford, West Gwillimbury with a 97% increase in 10 years, it actually went from 4,740 in 2006 up to 9,625 in 2016. So they already were the second largest community in terms of raw numbers before this change. And so those changes are significant that are happening in our communities in the southern part of Simcoe County. Part of the reason why there wasn't as much change in the city of Barrie in 2016 is because of the fact that land had not opened up. So permits hadn't been issued, building permits, for example, on the Salem lands. And so in 2021, I'm expecting to see significant changes in the population of the city of Barrie as well as the immigrant population. So look, people have questions about why people come into the country, what are their credentials? And so primarily immigration is an economic program of the federal government. And if you look at the data of age data for the province of Ontario and our country, you will see that we have an aging baby boom population who've already started to exit the workplace. And starting in 2015, there were more people in Ontario who were turning 65 than were turning 15. And those ages are important because those are typically the ages that we consider the entrance into the labor market and the exit from the labor market. And so there is no way from just a natural increase that we could consider replacing workers who are retiring. And so it is primarily an economic strategy. And that is the greatest number of immigrants come into Canada through the economic stream. And just to put some context behind that, generally speaking, under the economic stream, you need a master's degree or above to be approved to come into the country. So just to give you an idea of the level of talent who is coming into our country. The second stream of immigration is family reunification. And so those people who are joining, so their families sponsor them to come into the country. And part of that is that those families agree to financially support those those individuals who are coming through. And then the last category is for humanitarian purposes. And so we saw a large response in the Barrie community and Simcoe County as a whole to the refugee crisis in Syria in 2015 and 2016. And those are the primary categories. So you can see the distribution of immigrants, but also the differences in recent immigrants. So those people who've been in the country for 5 years or less, we see that we're actually a little bit more balanced towards family reunification. So immigrants come into communities either through a direct landing. So in the case of Simcoe County, that means that they landed at Pearson Airport and took some form of travel up to Simcoe County. And we have, I would say on average, somewhere between 600 and 750 per year direct landings. So people who landed at Pearson with the direct intention of traveling into Simcoe County. Most immigrants come into Simcoe County, though, as secondary migration. And so they have landed in the GTA. They've lived in the GTA for a number of years or months. Oftentimes it could just be months, and then they choose to relocate out of the GTA. And so interprovincial migration is the actual technical term for individuals who are transitioning across the province, and that applies to both immigrants and non-immigrants. You can see from this table, which includes upper tier municipalities and single tier municipalities and cities, where people are moving. So for example, you can see in Toronto, in this 5-year period, the average was about 25,000 people were leaving Toronto annually, and about 10,000 were leaving Peel region. But in Simcoe County, down at the bottom, you can see we actually, in our comparator municipalities, so communities like Niagara, like Durham, London, Middlesex, we had 6,157 individuals moving into Simcoe County. So our numbers of individuals coming in from intra-provincial migration were even higher than, for example, than Durham. So you can see that we have significantly higher rates of intra-provincial migration. That includes immigrants and non-immigrants, but is the primary mechanism for how people are moving into Simcoe County. And you can see that they are coming primarily from Toronto and Peel and York, and that is those are communities where their immigrant populations represent approximately, a little bit different for each one, approximately 50% of their population. So I'm going to move on to some specific Barrie data. I did say that I would share some Barrie specific data. And so in 2016, you could see that there were immigrants represented 13.4% of the total population in the city of Barrie. And that had increased in the 10-year period by 11.5%, as opposed to the population change in that same period of 1.7%. So that's always an indicator that is important to look at when you're looking at community change. Is this demographic increasing at a faster pace than the population as a whole? And you'll see that the number of recent immigrants increased by 9.1% during that period. I've also included the temporary residence data in this slide. I just want to point out that I've asterisked it because that number is what was reported in the census, but we know that that is not correct information. And some of the challenges with that is that temporary residents don't feel the requirement to fulfill the census should they receive it. But more importantly, many of our temporary residents in Simcoe County are international students, And the census takes place in May, and most post-secondary education is taking place between September and April. And so it's outside the period that they may be living in our community. Other aspects of City of Barrie data, and I do have more if people are interested, but some of the ones that I thought might be most interesting to people to know and to understand. So languages that are spoken most often at home. So 10.3% of immigrants living in the city of Barrie are reported speaking English and a non-official mother tongue. So that means they're speaking English and another language. And then those that reported only speaking a non-official mother tongue reported Mandarin, then Spanish, and then Russian. So just to give you an idea of who might be living in the community and may need additional supports when you're communicating with them. Just because somebody is nodding their head does not mean that they understood you. And so it's really helpful to think when it comes to communication, to think about, using active listening skills. So repeating back, making sure that there's been a transfer of knowledge. And then from an immigrant pathway perspective, who is living in City of Barrie, 45.3% of immigrant residents in the City of Barrie came through the economic pathway. And again, I earlier sort of reflected on what the standards are to come through that. So you have a very high level of very qualified people who are living in the community, who may not be their talent may not be being maximized at this time. If approximately just over a third who've come through the family reunification pathway, and you have a very high percentage, 17.1% of refugees. And that means in Simcoe County, we do not have a refugee resettlement program. So none of those are government assisted refugees unless they have moved up here subsequent to the end of their refugee support from the federal government. Most of those would be private sponsors. And so during the Syrian refugee crisis, there were several private sponsorship groups in the City of Barrie. And then I am aware, though, that, for example, in another community, there has been some movement of government-assisted refugees out of the GTA into communities because they happen to be friends with people who came through private sponsorship. And so they're relocating for those relationships. And then the last piece of data I'm going to share, and this sort of, and it will make the transition over to Rudy, is around racialized populations. And there is a relationship between immigration and racialized populations, but they are two distinct and separate variables. And so we know that from recent immigrant data, for example, immigrants who are coming into our communities tend to be coming from South Asian communities. And that means that, we have a much higher percent of racialized immigrants in our current waves of immigration. Whereas, for example, in older waves, post-World War II, when we had a lot of Germans, people from Germany, and individuals from Poland who came, they were Caucasian. And so, but that, I just really want to reflect that there is a relationship with immigration, but they can be separate. And so oftentimes you will see when you look at racialized individuals, they could have been living in Canada for generations. And so there's, they are two very different and distinct variables. But this data is specific to racialized populations. And what's really important to note is the significant pace of change of the racialized populations in Simcoe County. So in this City of Barrie, for example, where we looked at the fact that there had been I think it was a 13% increase in immigrant population in that period between 2006 and 2016, the change in racialized population was 67.5%. And again, you're looking at large numbers when you're looking at the city of Barrie. So those are still important changes. Bradford, West Gwillimbury, you can see the number of racialized individuals in their communities increased by almost 375% in that 10-year period. Those are significant changes in our community. The Simcoe County overall change in that period is just over 100%, but you can see that there are definitely communities where there is higher racialized growth. And that is why it's really important to be thinking about the content that Rudy is going to be sharing. And I am going to turn the presentation over to Rudy. And Rudy, if you can just let me know when you want me to advance slides for you.
Perfect. Yes, thank you so much, Sandy. And good morning, everyone. And thanks for joining us about embracing diversity. And with the data that Sandy so kindly shown, we see that it's really relevant here in Simcoe County. But I'd like to start us off with a few definitions and kind of sandwich diversity. So I'd encourage you to embrace equity, diversity, and inclusion, or EDI. And the reason being is if we're really gonna see diversity blossom into what we want it to be for everyone's benefit, we need equity and inclusion. Now, equity is different than equality. While equality means treating everyone the same, equity is giving everyone what they need to be successful, as this picture will illustrate. And I'd like to highlight, this just isn't for immigrant or racialized populations. Even if your culture was homogenous, you have to realize there's a different makeup within your society that requires equity. Think, for example, of single mothers or those with different abilities. Do they have the same advantages, or is your company equipped to help them succeed as well as a single able-bodied man? And this is why it's so important to have equity built in to our company and into our community if we're going to embrace diversity of all kinds to see everyone succeed and have them included. Next slide, please. So with EDI, and now I'm going to go on to diversity. Diversity is having, as these pictures shows, people of all different types and cultures within your company or your community. The challenge is if we just stay with diversity, we risk of committing tokenism. And what that means is we're just filling slots to show that we're diverse, right? We have a person from this culture or this ability or this community, but are they really included within the company? What does your senior management team look like? What does it look like here in Simcoe County? So if we're really going to embrace diversity, first we need equity so that all may have a chance to be successful and reach their full potential, which benefits everybody, benefits your company and community. So we need to have that diverse population included. Like Verna Myers said, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance. So while we embrace diversity, we also need to embrace inclusion and have everybody involved in the decision-making process. Next slide, please. So now we're talking about embracing EDI, or equity, diversity, inclusion. And this is a question I like to ask everybody. Now it's rhetorical, so don't feel obligated to start typing away, but please think about this. Beyond the moral obligation to embrace equity, diversity, and inclusion, why should we? In other words, what benefits does EDI bring to your place of business and to your community? Have you ever thought about that? Right? It should be just the moral obligation, but we really need to also concentrate on the benefits that it brings as well. If we're going to get everyone buying in and really maximizing the potential that an awesome, diverse workforce and community can bring. Next slide, please. So within my brief presentation here, I'm going to be referring to the Simcoe County Diversity Hub a lot. I encourage you to check it out because a lot of the material that I'm sharing here is right on the Diversity Hub, and then you can go and you can see the articles and see some of the research behind the brief points that I'm bringing up. So here are some benefits of embracing equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this is from talentfit.com. So here's some results. You get a variety of different perspectives when you're around your boardroom table. So think about it. If you have everyone from the same background or same culture or same degree for that matter, they're often going to approach your challenge, whatever it is, marketing, sales, customers, whatever it is, they're going to probably approach it in a very similar way. But if you have someone from a different background, different culture, different degree, right, they're often going to bring something to the table that you haven't seen. In a beautiful article that I read, I'll just share this example with you. There was a Canadian manufacturing company that had to reduce their water consumption, okay? Their water consumption was going through the roof, and as you know, so the costs will raise as well. It was a team member from a country where water was scarce that actually led the team on water conservation in their manufacturing process. And as you know, when we conserve in our manufacturing processes, of course, your bottom line is only going to get better. So this is one advantage of having these diverse perspectives from different cultures. You get increased creativity, faster and better problem solving, higher innovation, better decision making, increased profits. I can pretty much stop there. I think that's the point of business everyone wants to see, right, as increased profits. And what I like to highlight here too is higher employee engagement. This is where we get back to the inclusion. So when we have diversity around the table, are they engaged? And if they are engaged, then they feel included, which means you're going to have reduced employee turnover. Each of us who's been in business knows every time we lose an employee and have to train another, it costs us money. So if we can reduce that turnover and have that longevity, it's only going to make our company better and increase our reputation. Once your company gets that better reputation, I'm sure the talent's going to be knocking on your door to help your company along the way. Next slide, please. So on the Diversity Hub, you'll see articles such as this, and now this is from the BDC. Just succinctly put, this article says that the increased diversity helps your company compete globally. In other words, you can get closer to foreign markets when you have the locals on your team. As you know, foreign markets, and even here in Simcoe County, networking is very important. And within networking, trust. So when you have someone from the global markets that you're trying to break into that's already there and established trust, it helps your company compete globally all the quicker. Now, increased diversity also opens markets right here in Simcoe County. As Sandy was showing, we're having quite an influx of diverse cultures coming into our county. Now, as your diverse staff, and now let me qualify that, your happy diverse staff can introduce your company to otherwise closed or tight-knit groups. So these are some advantages, and I invite you to take a look at the Diversity Hub and look at these articles a bit more in depth because there's so many advantages. Now, you might say that's all well and good, but what about the bottom line? Well, let's go to the next slide. So here's an article from Forbes, and they share a study there that suggests a 19% increase in profits. Well, sign me up for that. Who wouldn't like to see almost 20% increase on their bottom line over the next year? But I'd also like you to consider our pandemic changed world that we're in today. Look at this other article here. Diversity strengthens and grows your online community. So if you recall that article from the BDC, again, a diverse team will help you reach an increasingly diverse audience. Same with the online community, which translates into increased market reach, which we all hope for will be an increased market share for our business. Next slide, please. So although that's been an extremely brief overview of benefits to your business, I'd like to say that the World Economic Forum concludes in this article here that the business case for diversity in the workplace is now overwhelming. So I'd invite you to do your homework. Invite the leadership within your companies to research these claims, these facts, these studies to see so that they could buy in. Because I have to ask you, is your business getting on board? And if they are going to get on board, you definitely need senior management to see these facts and to really embrace diversity, as the title of this workshop is called. Now, how do the benefits of EDI, equity, diversity, and inclusion, translate into our community? Well, let's take a look at the next slide. So the World Economic Forum goes on to say, outside of your workplace, here's our nucleus that we're building this diverse functional culture. Diversity is good for our communities, and this article will provide a bunch of evidence. Again, the time doesn't allow to go into all of the evidence, so I invite you to go to the Simcoe County Diversity Hub again. I get royalties every time I say that, so Simcoe County Diversity Hub, go ahead and visit that. And it'll show you the benefits of the community. Now, research and studies point to a greater overall well-being, social coherence, and all of the benefits of innovation, problem solving, and forward movement that your business can gain. Remember that example I shared about the water conservation in that manufacturing plant? So too, with a diverse community, we have people from different cultures. It can help our Canadian communities learn how to conserve our natural resources in ways that we may have never considered, because we've had such an abundance of all of these things. Next slide, please. So with all of these benefits, and if it's so beneficial to embrace EDI, or equity, diversity, inclusion, what's stopping us? Why isn't everyone on board? Well, there is a number of things, and here's just a few. Racism. That's been the hot topic, I'll say, for centuries and decades, and more recently over the last year or so for sure. Now, there's different types of racism. Okay, there's the overt prejudice that we see in communities and news reports. But I'd also like to say there's also opposing or ignoring anti-racism initiatives that actually perpetuate the continuation of racism, which prevents us from embracing EDI fully. Then there's systemic inequities and policies and procedures that you might not even be aware of until it's brought to your attention, because we're so used to it. And then there's internalized racism. If anyone here has ever been bullied in school, you might recall a feeling that you've had, and sometimes it can last for days, weeks, and sometimes even years later. You remember that shock to your system, that self-esteem of being bullied. So what happens with racism? It also becomes internalized into the people that receive it. So studies will show now that there's actually a decreased self-worth. And what happens in your workplace and in your community, if you have someone that is not operating to their full self-esteem or self-confidence, you're not actually getting everything that that person has to offer your company or your community. So it's actually quite an issue that we need to address. Then there's also cultural challenges. If you joined Lionel and I on our last meeting with the Barrie Chamber, we went into that quite in depth. There's hierarchical versus egalitarian cultures, and then all the misunderstandings that can come from that. It may seem chauvinistic or rude, and it's actually a cultural thing, and then misunderstandings ensue. There's communication barriers and cultural misunderstandings. I love Lionel's example. His mother tongue is French, right? So to ask is demandé, and Morgan could probably correct me if I'm pronouncing that wrong. But when he would write emails and everyone, he would translate it directly to his English colleagues. I demand this paperwork. I demand this. And he's just asking. So you can see how that might come across in a misunderstanding. And then there's also intracultural conflict that prevents us from embracing EDI fully. Now, intracultural conflict, a lot of people might not realize, and I'll use the example of the caste system in India. So the caste system in India, very basically put, the darker your skin, the lower you are in the caste. Okay, the lighter your skin, the higher respect you receive. Now, when these things come over with our immigrant population, and we're trying to embrace EDI without the understanding of these intercultural conflicts, we can actually be missing the boat, so to speak, on our efforts when we're not addressing all of the intricacies of the challenges that you might find within your workplace. And finally today, I just want to focus in on, and then there's on the next slide, implicit bias. So let's spend a few minutes on this. An implicit bias, and I'm going to quote from verywellmind.com, is an unconscious association, belief, or attitude toward any social group. Now, due to implicit biases, people may often attribute certain qualities or characteristics to all members of a particular group. And we know that as stereotyping. Okay, and that's why Stanford says here that their research on implicit bias suggests that people can act on the basis of prejudice and these preconceived stereotypes, but notice without intending to do so. And that's what's important to remember, that our implicit biases, and we all have them, operate almost entirely at an unconscious level. Okay, so while our explicit biases or prejudice, like we talked about the overt racism, that's intentional and controllable, our implicit biases are less so. Okay, and that's where they can come across, if you remember from our last seminar, as microaggressions and things that we didn't intend to offend somebody. So I invite you to look at the Diversity Hub again. You're going to see it's a brief TED Talk from Dusha Hockett. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. And he really goes well into implicit bias, highlighting its subconscious nature, how it can contradict our consciousness. Okay, so for our topic here, we can say that we really wholeheartedly embrace diversity, but our implicit bias might come across in a microaggression that would suggest otherwise. And the thing is, it's rapid and it's automatic, okay? And an assumption is formed. Let me give you an example. I was a carpenter for most of my life, and I worked in a lot of people's homes. I was in this one home one day, and I'm working away in the kitchen. And the homeowner that came in, she was actually a Chinese woman. The Chinese lady, she walked into the kitchen and she didn't say a word. She's going about her business. And I'm working away. And then when she talked to me, when she spoke, the thickest Jamaican accent I have ever heard came out of her mouth. And the surprise, I dropped my tools, right? Because I grew up around a lot of Jamaicans. And it surprised me, right? And I didn't consciously think, oh, here's a Chinese person, this is what I'm expecting. But my implicit bias had already formed an opinion of what this lady would sound like. And then when she spoke, there was a learning experience for me, right? I embraced diversity, but my implicit bias created an assumption that didn't allow for this person's unique diversity to have space. And so I stopped everything I was doing right there and then, and I got to learn about the Chinese community in Jamaica, which was a fascinating story in itself. Let's go to the next slide and talk a little bit more about this. So what causes our implicit biases? Well, the brain looks for patterns and shortcuts. In other words, it categorizes and clusters. And it does this automatically. It's looking for a fast and easy way to sort out all the information coming at us, like coming at you today, right? And these patterns are often formed by our experiences and our social conditioning, all right? Our upbringing, our social circles, and the media. So I'd like to do a little exercise here, and I'll invite you to put this into the chat box if that's working here. I'm going to ask you just to type the first thing that comes into your mind, right? When I say ice, what comes to your mind when I say ice? Just go ahead and put it in the chat box. So I got 3 answers here. They're all different. Anyone else? Awesome. I'll give it another 30 seconds if anyone wants to participate. What's the first thing that comes to mind when I say ice?
Rudy, I'm just going to interject here for a second. I noticed when I originally typed in box that it just went to panelists. So when you're in the chat function, there's a variable where you can say who it goes to. So I just wanted to encourage participants to click all panelists and attendees.
Oh, perfect. Thanks for that. Great. Yeah, we got another one. Cool. Perfect. Anyone else? We'll give it another 10 seconds. Wonderful. Wonderful. So we have box, vodka soda, cold, box, slushy, and cold. So we have a tie between cold and box, ice cold, ice box. Now I'd like to say, what if you're a hockey player or a figure skater? Now I'm going to say, pretend you're a hockey player or a figure skater. What do you think of when I say the word ice? Go ahead and type that in. Time, arena, fast, skates. Excellent. Any other thoughts when I say hockey player or figure skater? Then I say ice. Give it another 10 seconds. Perfect. So the purpose of this exercise is again to show you what your implicit bias brings when we see something or we hear something. Now, when we're talking about diversity, when we see someone of a different culture, we automatically think something. Now, remember the Chinese woman that I worked with in the kitchen. I didn't even consciously create that assumption. So when we hear or see someone of a different culture and we say ice, notice the first time we had box, vodka, soda, cold, slushy. These were things that our experiences with ice cause us to think of. But now when I primed you, okay, with hockey player or figure skater, notice how the answers changed. When you say ice, and we have time, arena, fast, and skates. So this is called conditioning, okay? So you have your implicit bias by your natural upbringing or your habits or your experiences, which bring us to vodka, sodas, ice boxes, cold, and slushies, right? But then we're conditioned by our environment or our other social circles or media. So when I say hockey player or figure skater, then our assumption changes. Time, arena, fast, and skates. So what I'm trying to say here is we have social influencers affecting our thoughts continually in the media. So when it comes to equity, diversity, and inclusion, We need to be aware of what's influencing us in our environment. And to a case in point, why do you think they spend so much on the Super Bowl commercials? That's to affect our thoughts and then our actions, right? And it's powerful. I recently conducted a study and wrote a paper called Brown and Bearded. In my paper, I drew from research on how the media, movies, and books post 9/11 often depicted the villains as brown and bearded versus the clean-shaven Caucasian heroes in the films. Now, sadly, this priming, these prompting, these cues, this conditioning still has its effects today, as seen by the horrific tragedy in London, Ontario last Sunday. And that's what's slowing us down in a huge way when it comes to embracing equity, diversity, and inclusion, is the hurtful profiling that affects our biases in a negative way. So let's turn to the next slide to see what we can do about this. So here's an excerpt from a great article that you can find on verywellmind.com. And it has some great suggestions on how to reduce our implicit bias, and more importantly, how to reduce the effects of the environment around you. Because as we're aware on social media that we're in this pandemic right now, a lot of the environment isn't helpful or conducive to embracing equity, diversity, and inclusion, is it? Right? So here's some strategies that we can implement. Focus on seeing people as individuals, all right? Take the time to see the person for who they are. In other words, consciously start trying to deconstruct learned stereotypes or perpetuated stereotypes that are in the media. And what you need to do this is pause and reflect, right? Let's all take a breath, pause and reflect, and take the time to adjust your perspective and try to see the other person's point of view, because you can be very surprised. You might have the assumption, remember the assumption that I had of the Chinese woman that I worked with, right? And I took the time to learn, wow, she's actually Jamaican, right? And I learned about everything she went through in the Jamaican community there. And it was far from an implicit stereotype that I had. Pause and reflect. Increase your exposure to other cultures. This is one of the best ways you're going to see how unique and individual everyone is, and actually all the talent that can come to your company and to your community, right? And you can actually get past that language barrier and see, wow, the intelligence that's coming, as Sandy was saying, into Simcoe County is absolutely phenomenal. And you'll learn how different and unique people actually are. So with this discussion here, and very briefly, let's remember our goal. Our goal is to create an environment in our companies and in our communities that fosters cultural safety and cultural humility. What does that mean? Well, let's turn to the next slide. Oh, the previous one. Yeah. So creating an environment of cultural safety and cultural humility. There's a site, Creating Climate for Change. I'm just going to give these definitions just to help us here. Cultural safety is an outcome based on respectful engagement that recognizes and strives to address power imbalances inherent, and this comes from a healthcare system model. The point is, cultural safety addresses power imbalances that results in an environment free of racism and discrimination, where people feel safe when they're receiving, in this case, healthcare or whatever your company offers. So I'm going to stress again, for cultural safety, we have to look at the power imbalance of those that would be in power versus the newcomers that are coming in to your company. There was a concern brought up in our last meeting, and it went like this. The concern was that immigrants or people of color not having the confidence to bring to light issues related to racism, anti-immigrant sentiment, or just general poor treatment by other staff. Now, Sandy and I had the opportunity to work with the OPP about hate crimes, and it was quite similar. People are reluctant to bring forth what they're suffering, okay, in fear of retaliation. And when it comes to our companies, it's not only fear of retaliation, it's also the fear of actually not being promoted, losing their jobs. So creating cultural safety is actually adjusting that power imbalance, or rather empowering the disempowered so that they feel safe enough to come to you when there's challenges, right? And what we need to do that is actually have cultural humility, which will help us along this way. Now, cultural humility is a process of self-reflection to understand personal and systemic biases and to develop and maintain respectful processes and relationships based on mutual trust. Cultural humility involves humbly acknowledging oneself as a learner when it comes to understanding another's experience. Again, I'm quoting for creating a climate for change. This is what we're looking for, isn't it? Is a climate for change. So in our company, if we have cultural humility, what I love about that is it allows you to say, I don't know about you. I'm empowering you to please educate me. Educate me on the challenges you're facing in my company. Educate me about the challenges you're facing in our community, right? Because I don't know and I want to help, right? So having that stance there will really help the other person open up. It'll help the person on the other side of the table actually feel safer because you've already acknowledged that you're the learner in the situation, and it opens up the opportunity for them to educate you about what they're experiencing. And the goal is, as the next slide will show, let's try to create a culture of self-reflection, open communication, and reconciliation. And that's where people look at themselves first and then communicate openly with each other about their hurts and their feelings. We need to educate people. We need to educate each other about things that are causing divisions, even unwittingly, such as implicit bias that may lead to microaggressions, and oppressive structural practices and policies that we might not be aware of. Now, as time doesn't permit to delve into all the various factors that help us embrace EDI, or equity, diversity, and inclusion, here's a sneak peek at a tool that Lionel and I are developing to help your staff begin communicating about such sensitive subjects. Now, please remember, this is just a rough draft that we're working on, but hopefully you'll get the idea. So the top boxes allows your HR manager to gauge the reported offense while allowing the offended person to express how the actions of the other made them feel. Now, as discussed at our last meeting, there are many instances of honest mistakes, communication errors, and cultural differences that might be prematurely misconstrued as a microaggression, racism, or discrimination. Now, the goal of this tool is to allow a learning opportunity for the accused offender to see the impact of their actions, even though their intent may be far removed from hate. So explanations, education, and constructive coaching of what microaggressions are, the effects of implicit biases, and the harmfulness of racism can ensue, as one can say, wow, you know, I didn't realize that was just an honest mistake. Thank you for letting me know that made you feel awful. I'm going to try to avoid that next time. And hopefully your staff and everyone can move forward learning and growing together. As the next slide will show, as I wrap up here, we're really trying to create an environment of cultural safety and cultural humility. And what we need is strong leadership. If you're going to affect meaningful change in your company or your community, and it often comes from the bottom up, but you know what? We need buy-in to a more equitable, diverse, and inclusive workplace and society, also from the top down. We need calm leaders to facilitate equitable and fair communication in our companies and communities. We need effective training and education of the multifaceted challenges we face, then that's a must. And you know what? Commitment to a better workplace and world will most certainly help us all overcome and truly embrace EDI. That's equity, diversity, and inclusion. And with my next slide, I'd like to thank you very much for allowing me to speak a few moments about building bridges toward mutual understanding. Thanks, Andy.
Thank you, Rudy. And I actually have a Q&A for you, so I'll leave that till later though. So, you know, Rudy's provided some really good information about equity, diversity, and inclusion and better understanding our implicit bias. And I think that recognition that we all have implicit bias. And, you know, one of the places, you know, where I really realized my own implicit bias has been because I spend more time walking around my neighborhood. And as I walk through my neighborhood and I see houses and the people I don't know, I create these stories in my mind. And so often when I actually get to meet the people, it's so different from, you know, what this story I've created in my mind. So I just really want to thank you for walking our participants through some really complicated content this morning, Rudy. And then I just, at this point, I just kind of want to change the conversation. So how do we get involved? So, you know, and Rudy talked about that commitment and the leadership. And so we wanted to share some information with you today on how to get involved and create some of that dialogue. One of the things that the federal government has come out with, and I've included the hyperlink at the bottom of this slide, is a 50-30 challenge to create diversity in the workplace. And really the 50-30 challenge, it's aspiring to two different goals. One is to create gender parity, so equity on Canadian boards of directors and senior management positions of both men and women. And I know much of our conversation today has focused around equity for people who may come from other cultures or who are racialized. But really, you know, there are some basics still there, and that is equity for women and men. And then the second part of the challenge, the 30 challenge, is a significant representation. So looking at 30% is where that 30 comes from. 30% of representation on Canadian boards and senior management of other underrepresented groups. So that includes racialized people, people living with disabilities, members of the LGBTQ2S+ community. And then they also recognize that individuals from our Indigenous communities are also underrepresented in positions of economic influence and leadership. So really strategically setting a goal to change the representation, and representation matters. And I think that's one of the things that's really important. You know, if you have little different things that you talk about and think about in your mind, you know, the phrase representation matters. And so, you know, changing the composition on boards, you know, so if you're part of a not-for-profit organization, what does our board of directors look like? If you're an organization, what does our senior management team look like? And creating some specific goals on how to change that. On the site, I was on it a couple of days ago. I think there's about 1,300 organizations that have currently joined the Workplace Challenge, the 50-30 Workplace Challenge. So again, it's a place, and it gives you lots of resources. If you join the challenge, it's a place to get resources and tools. So I encourage people to look at this opportunity from the federal government. Locally, we've been working with a number of different community stakeholders. So that was one of the things I didn't really share a lot about at the beginning of the presentation, is just who is the Partnership Council in Simcoe County. And the Local Immigration Partnership is made up of the Partnership Council of leaders in our community across all different aspects of the community. Because the reality is that you're an immigrant coming into the community, you touch all different parts of the community, all different aspects. So it could be in education, it could be in healthcare, it could be in employment. And so those leaders we've been working with on a number of different initiatives. One thing that we developed a few years back with funding from the provincial government was online information to support the recruitment, selection, onboarding, and retention of immigrant residents. And you can find that content on the county server at www. There's 3 W's in there, hireimmigrants.simcoe.ca. And it includes information for example, selection on credential recognition. And I know that was a question that came forward from the last webinar that was offered by Rudy and Lionel, information on credential recognition. And it is a fairly complicated topic on its own, but there is information about credential recognition on the hireimmigrants.simcoe.ca. We've also been very fortunate to have a program open up to support immigrant residents. So there's a job finding club for immigrants offered by Georgian College in Barrie. Right now, that program is being offered remotely through the use of technology. And so normally it would be operating in the downtown core, but right now it's offered remotely. What I wanted to state is that right now they've been having about an 80% placement rate in 3 months of the people who come into their program. So if you're looking for talent, and we talked a lot about how just the talent level of immigrants coming into our country, and you're an employer and you want to connect that way, they're a really great program. We also worked with Employment Ontario organizations to develop an initiative, International Experience Counts. That program wrapped up in 2018. But really, you know, those Employment Ontario agencies exist already in our communities. We've been working with their staff to help support them in supporting immigrant residents. And if you're looking at wanting to specifically increase the diversity, they have wage subsidies that they can use to support your hiring purposes. And again, it's another resource in the community. I believe in the city of Barrie, there are 4 Employment Ontario organizations, Georgian College, the Career Center offered by the school board, Agilic, and College Boreal. And then separately, there's a career conversation circle that is offered by the Barrie Public Library. And so that particular initiative is really focused on supporting immigrant residents in their conversations, but it's very focused on career. So that would be a great place to pop in, to meet some individuals, to be a leader, to offer your support. And Rudy has spoken. I feel like I should be paying you for the advertising, Rudy, because throughout the your presentation, you mentioned the Simcoe County Diversity Hub. And we launched the Simcoe County Diversity Hub in March as part of the It Starts campaign to reduce racism and discrimination in Simcoe County. We've worked with community stakeholders to help populate the Diversity Hub. We, you know, our area of expertise is not in racism and discrimination, but our area of expertise is more in bringing people together and partnerships. And so we've had a number of people who have worked on helping to share and contribute to the Simcoe County Diversity Hub. I'm just going to go through a little bit about what's on there, and then Morgane is going to share her screen and actually going to show us a demonstration. But within that, there's a lot of information about the Ontario Human Rights Code. It's been my experience that most people know about the Ontario Human Rights Code, but they don't necessarily know what that means in their day-to-day work activities, how that implicates the tasks that they do. Is their organization responsible to address the things in the Ontario Human Rights Code? So there's a number of different resources on there that relate specifically to the Ontario Human Rights Code. There's also some a section on definitions and terminology. And I think even as we went through this presentation today, there was probably words and expressions that are new, and what does that mean? And so we recognize that just the vocabulary is different. And so there's a whole section on definitions and terminology. The resources section is very rich and includes information on different kinds of discrimination. And then also breaks down some of the resources at different age categories. So for example, if you're a childcare center and you're looking for resources at an early learning perspective, we've worked with our early learning partners at the county to help populate information that's specific to the 0 to 6 age range. There's a discussion board. So this is a subscription-based online platform. And so it does provide the mechanism to talk with other people who are interested in joining this online community of practice. There's a calendar in there where we try and share information about upcoming training and events. And there's a section on training information and resources. Before we do the tour of that, I'm just going to flip to the next slide, and then we're going to come back to the Simcoe County Diversity Hub. And the last thing I wanted to talk about was, some of the best practices. And so thinking about and developing an understanding of the needs and challenges of different population groups. So considering what does it take to make a safe space? And I'll give you an example that I've seen sometimes in the workplace, and that people don't really necessarily always understand what's behind it. So from an integration perspective, if you have some individuals who work in your workplace and English isn't their first language, and they choose at lunch to sit amongst themselves and speak their mother tongue, sometimes people could be critical of that, not understanding really how fatiguing it is in your mind to be operating in your workplace in a second language. And so just be able to have a break where you're not really thinking, having to use your brain to think about the language that you're operating. That's just giving them a really fulsome break, and which is what a lunch break is supposed to be, to sort of recharge and re-energize. And that was a great example of how language impacts individuals. And then also, what are faith-based accommodations that you might want to make in your workplace? So do you want to create, for example, a space for prayers, depending on an individual's faith needs? Developing a workplace mentoring program is a really great way to support diversity in the workplace. Rudy talked about the Diversity Hub. There's a great article in there about how when a workplace mentoring program is offered, very often racialized individuals and women take up that offer of mentoring far more than other individuals in the workplace. And so that's a really great way to help support their development and leadership opportunities. Engage in multicultural celebrations. Understand that everybody is coming from different places and have different things that they celebrate. Providing cultural competency training for your staff. Using data to inform decision-making. And I think, back to the early days of the Local Immigration Partnership, when we would make presentations to the community, we would frequently hear there aren't any immigrants in Simcoe County. But even at that time, there was 50,000 immigrants living in our communities. But people, because they didn't walk in their door, they were thinking that there were no immigrants in the community. So using data to inform decision-making can be a very powerful way to bring about change. And then lastly, to connect with local ethnocultural groups. And the County of Simcoe has developed an ethnocultural and faith-based group inventory. And many of them are on social media. They lack the mechanisms to have formal websites. And so they're operating on social media platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and WhatsApp. And so if you're a company or an organization that is using those platforms to communicate information about your products and services, it's easy to tag into what's already out there. So if you want to make sure that you're getting your messaging to those groups, that's a great way to do it. And I think at this point, I'm going to bring it back to the Simcoe County Diversity Hub. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'm going to ask Morgan to share her screen.
Are you able to see my screen?
Yes, thank you, Morgan.
Okay, perfect.
So this is the online community of practice. You have control of it though, Morgan. I can see the screen, but I can't control it.
Yes.
So this is the Simcoe County Diversity Hub. In order to participate, there's no fees. It's absolutely free and it's available 24/7. Those are some of the great features of the online community of practice. You have to subscribe to it, so you actually have to join. And then that allows you to go in and look at different information. We've had a lot of support in developing the content. So even we've had libraries have been very strong supporters of the local immigration partnership. So they even organize some of the information for us in a way that is appropriate for from a library perspective. So I'm just going to ask you to bring up a couple of things, Morgan. And I'm going to ask you to bring up the calendar and the discussion board. So you can see, for example, in this month of June, there's information on there about different things that are happening in the community. Some of them are from Lakehead University. There's an intercultural dialogue. There's on the road to Indigenous cultural safety through Zoom. And so whenever we are aware of programming, and as much as possible, we try to include information on here that's free for the community to engage with. That's not always the case, and people do have to make livings, but we are trying to share information that might be available free as well. And then you'll see as well on the calendar, we try and highlight days that are specific to racism, diversity, and inclusion. So you can see, for example, National Indigenous Peoples Day, World Refugee Day, Russian Language Day. And so, for example, one of the things we noted in the data that was shared that, you know, Russian was one of those languages that is frequently being used in homes in the city of Barrie. And then Morgan, can you skip to the discussion board? And you can see that there are a number of conversations that have been initiated on here, and there's an opportunity if you want to ask a question. Some of the questions that been asked: how can white men be anti-racist? Some concrete steps, an anti-racist journey, bias, cultural appropriation, and microaggression in the workplace. All really great articles and information, and an opportunity to talk with people on the site. And I think that's a great part, is that the site is intended for like-minded individuals to share ideas and learning. And then Morgan, if you could just quickly go back to the recommended reading and recommended movies. So again, this is where that help from the libraries came in, and making sure that everything was properly organized. But again, a number of different books that we suggest for reading to help people on their journey. And then also the movies, because not everybody's a reader. I have a son who would be like, I'm not reading a book, but he would watch a movie. So again, we try and include movies because we know that's an important learning aspect. And then the last piece I just wanted you to touch on, Morgan, could you pop into this section under resources that's age specific? So you can see the information that's been broken down here into the categories of early learning, 2 categories for school age, elementary and secondary, educator resources, post-secondary resources, and resources for seniors, although I don't think we populated the resources for seniors section. But we do recognize that even, for example, Lakehead University has taken some significant steps, and they specifically wanted to share some of the resources that they are doing at a post-secondary level. So I just wanted to give you a bit of a tour and a taste for the Diversity Hub, and encourage you to sign up for that. Again, it's totally free and it's available 24/7. It's an online community of practice. So I'm just going to ask you to stop sharing your screen, Morgan. And I just wanted to wrap up our formal conversation with Rudy's information. So building bridges towards mutual understanding. And he has a website who's coming soon. Rudy, I don't know whether you wanted to pop in there.
Yeah, definitely. We're excited about it. I'm shortly going to be registered as a social worker within Ontario, and ready to practice on many different levels. So we're trying to gear a website to obviously attend to equity, diversity, and inclusion, especially within Simcoe County, and be available for training purposes to help bring it forward and embrace it like this workshop's been all about. Thank you again for the opportunity.
Thanks, Rudy. And we're going to open it up to the Q&A. I just wanted to leave you with information about the contacts for the Local Immigration Partnership, myself and Morgan. And you can email us at any time at sklip@simcoe.ca. And also just encouraging you to check out the website, www.higherimmigrants.simcoe.ca. And I see that there are a number of questions. Paul, how did you want to manage the Q&A?
I think if we go back to the panelists here, I'll start asking some questions, and you guys can pick them up as you need to go, and we'll go from there. But we will collect that information from you guys about the LIP, and Rudy's information, provide that in the chat. It'll also be in the Q&A upper portion of the Facebook Live, so it's a resource that people can go back if you didn't get a chance to write it down. So when we stop sharing, and we'll get to some questions.
Great.
Perfect. There we go. That was great. I mean, you know, the more I get involved with this stuff, the more I find that most of the stuff is common sense, and for most, you know, when it's presented in the way that it is. And I think the last session that we did with Lionel was fantastic and a great opportunity. And we have one more of these coming in our series, which we'll talk a bit about in a few minutes. But it's just building on that great information. I have a question that's about the Diversity Hub, because it's sort of fresh. We just came off of the Diversity Hub. One of the things that I found really useful in it was the notification feature. So is that something that's available, you know, to everybody to be able to go in and get notified when things change, either on the calendar or new programming is coming up?
That's a great point, Paul. And so I just wanted to point out, we offered 5 information sessions or orientation sessions for the Simcoe County Diversity Hub during the month of May and a little bit into June. And we capped them at 20 because we wanted to try and make sure that they could have some level of interaction. And we completely filled those 5 classes. When you attend an orientation session, we actually take you through the logistics of signing on and setting those notifications, because you're right, Paul. It's much easier to stay connected when you get notifications to let you know that something new has been posted, or somebody's commented on the discussion board, or something new has been added to the calendar. And so there is a way to set that. And I would encourage people, if you're interested in joining the Simcoe County Diversity and you want a formal orientation, to reach out to the LIP. We will be offering them again in the fall.
Yeah, it's well worth the time. There's so much information on there. And again, I set up a few notifications on things that I was sort of interested in. We're following some of our programming, and getting that timely information when there's changes is really, really helpful. So certainly encourage everybody to join up when those sessions come back. And we have a number of questions in here. Most of them are anonymous, so I'm not sure who's asking the questions, which I guess is a good thing. So I'll just dive in, and I'll try to direct them as best I can. A lot of these may have been answered in the material, but I think covering them again isn't a bad thing. So how do you know that your workplace is actually inclusive on a daily basis and not just by the people you employ?
Well, I'll jump in there for a moment then.
Okay.
It's by basically seeing what is your company involved with outside of what's going on within the workplace. So if you think you're being equity, diversity, inclusion as a part of your inner workings and you're satisfied with that, if I understand the question properly, is like, how do you know it's actually happening on a daily basis beyond the people you employ? See what your company is involved with, right? What are they doing within the community to promote and support equity, diversity, and inclusion? And a great thing is actually, I'm just going to grab it here. There's a great way for your company to get involved with sponsoring the Simcoe County Local Immigration Partnerships Newcomer Awards. That's not
word out. You gotta stick it in front of your face.
There, it goes like that.
There we go. Okay, that's better.
In any case, the Simcoe County Local Immigration Partnership, and that's just one example, has an awards program every year. And how that works is various companies can sponsor at various levels. Okay, and what this does, it actually supports newcomers and also supporters to newcomers and racialized ones and equity, diversity, inclusion in the community. So that's a great way to see if your company is actually going beyond their employees and into the community. That's one suggestion I have. I'll turn it over to the other panelists for any others.
Yeah, I think one of my suggestions for that, and when you're looking at, doing this kind of work, I think it's really helpful to start benchmarking, and that can be tough because probably your initial survey is going to provide you with some results that may be troubling. But by putting in place measurement and starting to benchmark, that gives you the capacity to go, okay, what are the things we need to address and how do we make change? And I certainly know that one of the organizations in the broader public sector, we've been working with the coalition. I don't know if any of you know the Simcoe County Coalition for Children, Youth, and Family Services. It's a coalition of about 41 organizations. They've been working on a cultural safety self-assessment for organizations to undertake exactly for that reason, to start benchmarking. And it is an intimidating process when you first undertake it. So you have to kind of steel yourself for the fact that you're probably going to hear some results that you're not, we all like those feel good surveys. But, this is how you benchmark, and this is how you start to track, and this is how you implement change.
Yeah. And I think, as we bring the chamber through our process, you're going to have to face some uncomfortable truths. Initially, okay, well, we'll get involved with this. It sounds good, and then the more you get into it, that those gears start turning, and you're like, okay, all right, this is a lot deeper than we initially anticipated. So, but it's a good journey. I think it's one of those things that actually makes you feel better about some of the things you're doing at work and how you're presenting. So, one of the things that I've been looking at is the 50-30 challenge. We have our new board being installed on June 16th. So you start taking a look at, okay, how is our board structure? We didn't really do anything overt to start creating a diverse board, but in looking at the numbers, we're sitting at about an 85% diverse board between women, Indigenous, and people of color, which is fantastic, and it's kind of gotten there organically. And then when we look inside as well, our staff is at a particular place. but we're still not there yet. So I think even though you may get to some of those targets, the targets are just a benchmark. I mean, they don't necessarily mean that you're there yet, and I think that's important. That there's still more work to do, in as we discussed before about the things that you do outside of work. So, but the question in here with regards to working towards the 50-30 challenge, how do you avoid people feeling like they're tokens, and that they're invited only because of their ethnicity rather than because of their value to the organization? And I guess I would point out as well that it's not just the tokenism that runs into that you see there. There's other, kinds of diversity and inclusion that may not be immediately apparent, and you have to keep that in consideration as well. So probably a better one for Rudy, I guess.
Yeah, definitely. That's a great question. Tokenism is something we definitely want to avoid, and that's why we get into inclusion and get them involved. Coca-Cola is an example we brought up, I think, at our last seminar. It was almost, I think, $200 million US dollar lawsuit they faced for racism and discrimination back in 2000. And basically what they did was set up a mentorship program. Okay, and basically the diversity that was being brought into the company, they were paired up with a senior mentor, and then that mentor would raise them up. Long story short, over a 15-year period, actually 17 executive positions, and including the CFO, were held by diverse members of the community. And the CFO actually identified as a Black woman in America, right? So the mentorship program has been proven effective to get the inclusion happening and to limit tokenism, because what you're getting there is buy-in by senior management, because they want to see their mentees succeed, because that reflects well on them, right? And so it becomes a win-win. That's one suggestion.
Yeah, a good suggestion. And I think, mentorship in our city is, and even in our chamber is something that we need to continue to work on. We've been looking at a number of different programs that run with the city, but they all have the same intent in mind, which is to guide people to a better outcome. So so here's a question. We already sort of covered this. Does the Diversity Hub include a calendar of important days celebrated by various cultures in Simcoe County? Be nice to be able to acknowledge these occasions for members of my team, but when I've looked online, the list I've found aren't consistent, and I don't know which is the best source to use. So yeah, I'll answer that one. The simple answer is yes. And if you put a notification in when you train, then you know what's coming up. So we're hoping to be able to have a link to that calendar on our new website when it comes up in our inclusion page, so that that's stuff that'll be readily available even through the chamber website. So hopefully that satisfies the answer.
And in addition to the calendar, which is kind of like what's happening today and includes training, there is embedded in there, and I'm just going to ask Morgan because she is very familiar with the content. There is a multicultural calendar that has tons of information by month about all of the different cultural celebrations. They could be cultural, they could be religious. And so that document is embedded in the resources on the Diversity Hub. Morgan, I don't know whether you can comment a little bit more on that. You're on mute.
Nope, we're just not hearing you.
No, we're just not hearing you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Now we can hear you.
Oh, okay. It was just because I put you on speaker. Okay. So to go back to the Diversity Hub, yes, there is a multicultural calendar that was shared with individuals. This is actually a sought after resource in the community. So our teams worked on putting together a multicultural holy day and holy days. We shared it in the discussion board, and it's also in the resource section of the site. And I believe that if you're just looking at resources in the community, I know that the Simcoe County District School Board also publishes a multicultural calendar every year for every school year. So that's also an alternative as well.
Awesome. That's a great resource. And again, I'm happy to say that we're going to have a couple calendars in our event side that are event related specific to the chamber, and then other things that are happening in the community. And we'll be able to include that information into that page. People often get defensive when you start talking about racism and bias. How do you best approach this conversation so that people don't shut down, particularly if you're trying to convince your manager or company owner to make changes? So something we covered a bit more with our last, but I think we should be covering that again. Rudy, I think it's probably best one for you.
Yeah, that's definitely a great question, and it's going to be a continuing challenge. So on the committees that I've sat on at Lakehead with the Office of Human Rights and Equity, we'd have to face this. And I found that when you come across offensive, people automatically get defensive, right? So a lot of the conversations that we start to initiate, if there was a policy or procedure or a professor that was acting in a way that was hurting students, right, was basically to go about it very calmly and just start sharing things as opposed to pointing the finger, right? And that goes back to the tool that Lionel and I are developing. And we started giving people the opportunity, basically. Are you aware of what you said or how this policy is affecting this group of people, right? Just ask them, because they might not be aware, quite honestly, before we start saying, you're this or you're that, right? And we found when we asked the question, are you aware, right? That tended to limit the defenses and gave them the opportunity to say, no, I'm not aware. Convincing them to make changes when they're the manager or company owner, that's the challenge. And that's where we talked about, although from the bottom up, we're trying to create change, we really need buy-in from top down. And that's why we're talking about the advantages to bottom line, right? Increased profits, increased community productivity and coherence. We need to keep on selling some of these benefits. So those are a couple of suggestions. Again, approaching calmly, give people the benefit of the doubt and allow them to explain themselves.
Now, one of the best lines I've ever been that used in terms of dealing with people and in the different situations is the phrase, help me to understand. So it's a non-defensive kind of approach. Help me understand why you're thinking that way or why we have to take this approach. It gives them an opportunity to explain where they're at without having to, you don't have to pick a side when you're asking the questions. So Sandy, you look like you were going to jump in there and I cut you off. I apologize.
No, that's okay. And it's interesting. One of the things that we had tried to do, we're a very small team. They're all here on this call today. When we originally started our work and we, talked about where we wanted to focus our attention, we have primarily focused on the broader public sector. And part of the reason what we have primarily focused on the broader public sector is conversations we had early on, is that we recognize the private sector would need to adapt or die. And because the consumers are changing. And so in the private sector, as consumers change, as the workplace changes, you need to adapt or you're not going to be able to stay in business. Whereas the broader public sector receive their funding for the most part through a third party, and they don't necessarily need to be as responsive to changing consumers. So we, when you look to the GTA, you will see car dealerships that are advertising that they have salespeople from different ethnicities who speak different languages. And the same with real estate companies. And, the reality is that if you're making a major purchase like a car or a house, you want to be able to fully understand your legal documents. And so you're seeing in the GTA already that adaptation to the changing consumer. And so I just, that's why we give data. That's why we provide data all the time. And so we're happy to share our data because that helps make the business case.
Absolutely. And it's a good point, and then hopefully, other, you don't want them to make the change just for that reason. Hopefully the other part of it gets embraced when they see the benefit of how happy people are when they're not in those kinds of environments, and not just what the bottom line impact is. So, Here's a question we haven't discussed this one. Why is it encouraged for immigrants or exchange students to change their name to a more Canadian name when they come to Ontario? Shouldn't we be embracing their given name and teaching the community how to pronounce names from other cultures?
That's a great question. And I would never encourage somebody to change their name. It's part of their identity. Like you think about, your identity and who you are, your name is so important. But there has certainly been a lot of research that indicates that by changing their names, immigrants are more likely to get called. One of the things that we share on hireimmigrants.simcoe.ca is a pronunciator. So you can type in somebody's name and then it can online, and then it tells you how to pronounce a name for spelling that's unfamiliar. Sometimes just because it's difficult to pronounce somebody's name, the resume falls to the bottom. And so that's why I think many immigrants have anglicized their names just for their own. I want to be more competitive in the marketplace. But I would never encourage somebody to change their name because that's their identity.
I think that goes to what Rudy was talking when you start getting into implicit bias, right? I mean, you look at the name and immediately, what pops up in your mind is, you've made a predetermination as to who they are. And there you go. And I'll give you an example. We, on a regular basis, have to work with Prabmeet Sakaria, who's the Minister for Small Business and Red Tape Reduction, and he's a Sikh. So, I mean, when you look at him, you immediately think that there's going to be a thick accent and all these other things. And he is better allocation than I do. And you're right. It's just one of those sort of shocking things when you first hear him. It changes the way that you think about that individual. That implicit bias piece is very interesting. I put a smart ass comment about vodka and soda, but I mean, I've done some of these implicit bias tests out of that. I think it's the Harvard study or whatever it is, but it's an eye opener when you start going through that stuff. So I would agree with you, Sandy, that you shouldn't be changing your name there. But again, if you got to work and you need a job and that's going to get your foot in the door, then perhaps it's a practical tactic that needs to be done. So.
Yeah, I was just going to jump in there too. And the study that Sandy referred to, one of them, it's been replicated where there have been identical resumes and only the name was different, right? And where the Western names were on the resume, those were the ones that were called. And there was a severe reduction in the non-Western names for those called in. And so what happened is, and I know of my parents, for example, my name is Rudy. I have a German short form for a name, right? And that's it. I get asked by people of color all the time, what's your real name? It's Rudy. No, what's your real name? It's Rudy. Leave me alone about it. Right. And so I have cousins also that were given Western names. But what's interesting, I see about that question, should we be embracing their given names? They're having children now and they're giving them purposely strong ethnic names from their backgrounds, right? So we're starting to see the changes. They sat around the kitchen table when they came to Canada and their names were changed to Canadian names. And now with their kids, it's going the other way around. So we're starting to see the tides change, thankfully.
Yeah, and I think, again, as you start looking at, things that happen even with residential schools, those cultural changes, when you force somebody to change that makeup, you're robbing them of something that you really have no right to rob them. I mean, what would happen if you came to me and said, I don't like Paul, it's a weird name, we should name you something else. I mean, I can't even imagine how I would feel not being able to use that given name. So I think you'd have to walk in somebody else's shoes to a certain extent, and not judge every book by the cover. Sometimes if 50% of the immigrants are coming in around master's level or above, and they just can't get jobs here because of either accreditations or whatever, I mean, you're taking a gamble on probably the best employee you could have ever had, just simply by their name. It's a fatal mistake in my opinion, but that's good. It was a good question. So working and this is more working in a male-dominated industry, I find it a challenge dealing with clients who are rude because I'm a woman. I feel this from management, but it certainly is apparent from our clients, general public. I often overlook it because the sales team is more important than their attitude. Is there a way to address the public without compromising the business?
I'm going to step in. I used to be the director for women on the Simcoe Muskoka Workforce Development Board. And I also ran some women in skilled trades program at Georgian College earlier in my career. And I remember how challenging it was for a lot of those students to be working in predominantly male industries. And I just really appreciate your sensitivity in supporting the employer, but ultimately that is the employer's role to sort of start thinking about how they can manage that. I remember way back, and I'm getting closer to retirement, so it was quite some time ago. But some of the things, when we spoke to employers, they didn't want to put in a different washroom. That was 25 plus years ago. Now we're at a point where everybody shares a washroom is not an issue.
Yeah.
And so, but it's really, the employer, if the employer wants to support that, then there are different subtle ways that they could provide support for a female employee.
Yeah, it's worrisome. My daughter's, changed her topics again. She's going to be going to Georgian College in September in the cabinet making program. So going into skilled trades, and university educated, didn't like marketing, wants to work with her hands, use her creativity. But my biggest concern is that she's going to be in a male dominated area, and I don't want her, she's going to have to work on her own, but I fear that that sexist kind of a environment that she's putting herself into. She's going to embrace it, and no one's going to get around her head, but it's definitely there. So
I remember some of the women that we had speak and come in to sort of mentor some of the female students, and I remember one of the individuals talking about one of the things as a woman, because a lot of the time women's hands are smaller than their male counterparts. So in the skilled trades, sometimes they were able to get their hands in and their fingers in different places. And so oftentimes it was that recognition of their value and the fact that they sometimes, that you automatically think, well, they can't lift as heavy, but sometimes it's like they can do other things. Sometimes they can lift just as heavy, but also they might be able to do things that are really advantageous for the team. So I remember those kind of stories being shared with some of the women who are working in those training in those programs.
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a blog, I guess, a video blog that went out with a very well-known construction guy, and he made some very off comments about females in the workforce, and basically, I guess a carpenter or somebody on the blog, made a comment. He didn't like it. Now he's suing the carpenter. But the rest of the construction industry is going after this well-known guy for being, for not embracing, women in the workforce and doing the right thing. So I think to a certain extent, all this work that's happening is beginning to start self-regulating those industries, which I think is the end goal. And it's nice to see that sort of happening. So I have faith that my daughter will be okay. In a city like Simcoe County, where diversity is growing, but still predominantly a Caucasian community, how can we build a more diverse team? Well, I think you got to put yourself out there, get involved. If you want people to join your team, you need to be open and available for them to come to it.
I think too, people so often when they thinking about diversity, they're thinking about visible diversity. And so, for example, one of the languages that we saw was Russian. Well, if you see somebody in the parking lot at Walmart who's Russian, you're not going to necessarily know that they're from another country until you actually talk to them. And so we do have quite a bit of our diversity until recent immigrants would have been people from Eastern Europe. And so there's a lot of diversity that's not always visible diversity. And, we think about some of those other elements like sexual orientation, gender, there's all different aspects of diversity. But then I also wanted, to point out there are communities in Simcoe County that are visibly diverse. We looked at that map early on. So if you're trying to recruit for visible diversity, make sure you're putting ads in the Bradford, West Gwillimbury, New Tecumseh area. a lot of those people are commuting to Toronto and may enjoy having a more local ride to work.
Yeah, that's very true, because there's not a whole lot of affordable places in Barrie right now. I mean, and that in itself is something that's sort of creating problems for that this community to grow. Is there's no place for people to live. Whether you've got lots of money or you don't have any. Just the shortage of housing, I think, is a huge issue. So again, something with the master plan that I think over time will fix it, but we need something more in the short term. And the last question I have in here, and we've got 10 minutes left, so our timing is pretty good. What's the best way to approach a staff member who's feeling, I feel is using implicit bias, but I believe is unintentional? How do you start that conversation? So I guess that refers back to the, the answer we had earlier, which is to ask them if they realize that maybe they're coming off with bias. That's maybe probably not the best way to ask the question, but yeah.
And that's where that tool that Lionel and I are working on might help as well. We develop like a Likert scale. You can even use a happy face, right? Like a mute face and a frowny face, right? And start opening up the conversation. But I think one of the best ways, I was watching a movie with my kids. It was a cartoon movie called Mitchell and the Machines. Or I think that's what it was called. In any case, it was about a human family and then robots. Anyways, the human father started going bleep, bleep, blurp, blurp, bleep, bleep, blurp, blurp. And the robot said to him, "Excuse me, may I take this opportunity to educate you on how harmful and hurtful that stereotype is?" Right? And I laughed and I go, "That's a perfect way to say it. Excuse me, may I take this opportunity to let you know about the intent, or sorry, the impact of what you just said. You might not have intended it to be bad." And again, it's giving people the benefit of the doubt, saying, "Hey, may I just share with you how that made me feel, even though you might not have intended that way, and let's talk about it."
Yeah, I think that that tendency for fight or flight, it's inherently human. If you're making a quick decision on how am I going to handle this, am I going to fight or am I going to just let it go? And I think, trying to find a solution that's not fight or flight to get to the end result is what we need to be looking for. So that tool, I think, will be very helpful for sure. So we're going to get into a closing here, but did any of you have any closing comments before we wrap this up? Again, we're pretty good for time, so feel free. Sandy, you got your mic off. Why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'm just really happy that we've had the occasion to come out to the Barrie Chamber a couple of times and talk about diversity, and specifically we are very focused on supporting economic and social outcomes for immigrant residents, and we're happy to come back another time if there's another way to support the chamber. So for example, I know the topic of credential recognition, that's a big topic that probably should be handled on its own. So yeah, and I just really encourage people to join the Simcoe County Diversity Hub.
Awesome. And Rudy, freshly minted degree.
Yes. And I just like to echo Sandy's sentiments there. Thank you very much for having us. And with the work that Sandy does at the Simcoe County Local Immigration Partnership with Morgan and Ruby, it was an awesome time being there. And it gives me hope, right? That we're going to see some real change happening here in Simcoe County. And I'd love to see us with the work that you're doing at the Barrie Chamber with your team, Paul, and with the Simcoe County Local Immigration Partnership. Let's be leaders in Ontario on to show how we can embrace this. Thanks again for having me. You're welcome. Thanks very much for being with us today. In closing, I'd like to thank you for your attention and for participating. We're working hard. We get back to a partial reopening on Friday, which is great, but we're not out of the woods yet. So please continue to do the work that you do to flatten the curve, follow the guidelines, get involved in our rapid screening program that we're running. Free rapid screening kits out of the chamber for businesses of 150 employees or less. Very easy to join up, very easy to continue on with it. As it stands, we're at 2.4 million screens throughout the province.
And we are at upwards of 70, almost 80 businesses have joined in with very little push from the chamber, but we're looking to grow that. In Cambridge, Kitchener-Waterloo, they're up to 3,000 businesses. That's more where we like to see. I found out today that Bradford is actually going to join up and partner with us because they don't have the facilities in that end. So we'll be able to service businesses as far south as Bradford, which is great. We've got a few things that are coming up in the near future. Annual general meeting on June 16th at noon. We'll get an opportunity to see you and meet your new board. Sneak peek at our new website. We'll have an opportunity to show that and learn about our results from last year and what our plans are moving forward. We have How to Do Diversity and Inclusion Right on June 22nd at 1 p.m. We have a Facebook and Instagram Demystified, How to Maximize and Optimize Your Business Presence on June 29th at 1 p.m. with Krista Lariviere from Mintent. Her first session that we did on, I can't remember what it is. I was doing so well. Anyways, it was great. So I would encourage you to come out to do that one. And we have our Chamber Chat Networking. Unfortunately got pushed because of our AGM, but it's back on June 30th at noon. So looking forward to things. And I think, yeah, you know, credentialing would be a good topic to get back to. I think that's something we need to take a look at. And also maybe include in there some of the things that are happening with vaccinations and you know, targeting particular communities because of the COVID thing and what we can do to maybe you know, do a better job in not letting that happen. Obviously, recent events have been very devastating, and we don't want that happening again anywhere, especially in Simcoe County. So with that, I will say have a great afternoon. We're in time for lunch, so have a great lunch and an enjoyable weekend, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye, guys.
Thank you. Bye. Take care.